This week on Family Matters on Sundays, Nazarena and I are debunking myths about child support. I was just saying, I have noticed that I keep doing this, and I watched this meme on the internet the other day about when people get nervous, they sing their words.
Are you singing?
Like, sing your words, like, I'm live, like, we're here.
And I start singing. I might start singing.
And I don't need to sing for any reason whatsoever. Oh, look, James just tuned in with us.
Hi, James.
And the BCHBA tuned in with us, so they were.
I think it was probably me trying to figure out how to do this. I have like 12 profiles.
It was you doing it.
Yeah.
Well, good morning. Oh, look, you have your coffee and I have my coffee. It's like, well, I have my tea.
Yeah, I'm half asleep. I needed it.
No, nobody needs me on coffee. Caffeine is not my friend. Hey, James. All right, so I was saying that I'm going to try to get the restream figured out for next time, but this actually worked pretty okay.
It was fine.
For you to jump on here, so hopefully this works out. And a lot of times, I'm hoping that people will tune in and ask questions, or you can post questions before when we're going to do these lives for us to answer, but we decided that today we would just chat a little bit about child support myths. I think it's like I run obviously our social media, and so I am the one that like sees all these questions and answers all these questions, and people have so many misconceptions about child support and how it works. And then we also get all kinds of weird questions about child support or weird expectations about child support. So I thought it would be good to kind of debunk some of the myths today. So do you have any myths about child support?
I do, and you're going to know which case I'm talking about when I say this. But a lot of times people think that you can just make up a number. And you could just say, there you go, that you can just say the amount of money that you want in child support, and that's what gets ordered. And they don't seem to understand that you have to use the formula. Now, obviously, there's some wiggle room, right? And you could deviate and you can, play with it a little bit. But at the end of the day, you have to use the formula. And for those of you who don't know, the formula that we use in Florida is based primarily off of the incomes of both parties, as well as the time sharing. Who has the overnights, who has more overnights than the other. So apparently some people just want to ignore the formula, and you can't. You have to use the formula in Florida.
Yeah, and it's funny. So the case that Nazarena is talking about is one of these situations where somebody did not have an attorney at one point in time and just kind of verbally agreed and made a few payments of a certain number, but it wasn't like a court order or anything like that. And then he hired us and we're like, wait a minute, that number, where did that come from? Like, that seems a little high. Perhaps we should actually look at the guidelines. And it's just funny in that case because opposing counsel is very insistent that he continues paying this old amount that he just sort of randomly made up on his own and made a couple of payments for. Well, one of the myths that I always hear about child support is that men are the people who pay child support. Yeah. This comes up on the internet all the time, like, child support is like discriminatory against men. So you want to break that down a little bit because that's one of my favorite ones that I hear.
So really, again, it's based off of the formula, right? So, and it's sad because a lot of guys think I have to pay the child support and I'm not going to have, 50-50 with my kid or much less majority time sharing. It's actually very sad that a lot of guys feel that way. They call me and they say, I'm going to have to pay no matter what. But fortunately for men these days, the laws have really changed. And as a matter of fact, in July, it changed in Florida that the presumption is dads are entitled to 50-50. And that's important for purposes of child support because, depending on how much time sharing you have, how many overnights, will determine the child support amount. So let's say, for example, mom and dad make the same amount of money and they have 50-50 time sharing. Ostensibly, nobody will pay anyone child support in that case because the dad has 50-50 time sharing. And a lot of people also assume that it's the person who makes the most money who's going to get stuck paying child support. And that's also not true because it really depends on who has the majority of the time sharing.
Yeah, it's kind of this like complicated analysis where your income plays a role, the number of overnights plays a role. But one of the things you just said was actually one of my myths, is like people assume that if you have 50-50, there's no child support. Well, if you make the exact same amount of money and you have the exact same health care expenses and child care expenses, and then you have 50-50, well, yeah, then there would be no child support. But most of the time, people do not make the exact same amount of money. So if you did have 50-50, the one who makes more money would be paying child support. But if that person has more overnights than the other one, then it would bring it back down. So it's just this like complicated formula. And by the way, the formula is also, there are instances where it's apparently Glitch and Crash are just going to join this.
They just want to be on the live.
But the other thing with the formula is, like, we use a software program, the same one that the courts use. And the software program does like math that my brain is not capable of doing. And sometimes it does weird things too. Mostly because of like the gross up thing. So like gross up is what we talk about anytime somebody has more than 20% of the overnights. Glitch, it's like not the moment. It really isn't. Let's go here. When you have more than 20% of the overnights, then your child support starts to come down, down, down more and more with the more time that you have. And so occasionally this weird thing happens where if you have like 20% of the overnights, you get one number. And if you have 25% of the overnights, you actually get a higher number because the math in it does something bizarre. So it's like a weird glitch on it, but which is why when people ask us like, hey, what's my child support going to be? I don't know. I mean, I never have any idea until we get to the formula, have the number of overnights, have everybody's income information. So do you have any other myths about child support?
I do. I have one where people think that they can just waive child support and not deal with it and not ignore it and not put it in the agreements or the court orders. So unfortunately, the people think that it's the parent's right to receive child support. Well, I don't want that person's child support. I don't want that person's money. But that's not the way the law sees it. The way the law sees it, that's the right of the child. The child has the right to receive that child support from the other parent. So let's say dad has to pay mom. Mom can't say, it's my child support, I don't want it, I don't want his money. No, it's actually your child's child support. It goes to your child's expenses. So you can't just ignore it, you can't waive it. We're not allowed to do that. We get parents who ask us to do that all the time, and we can. So it has to be calculated pursuant to the formula that we're talking about, and it has to be included in agreements, and it has to be included in any court order. You can't just waive it. Now, how you receive it can vary, right? You don't have to necessarily go through the depository to have it paid that way. You don't necessarily have to have it taken directly out of a person's paycheck. It can get paid directly from one account to another, from one parent to the other. So there are things that, we could be creative and figure out to do.
Or even by payment of certain expenses. Right? Like the parties can, court's not going to do that, but the parties could agree on that. That, and that's actually what one of the things that happened in my mediation that I've gone on and on about this week with the little teeny tiny baby.
I remember.
Was there because of the dynamics of the situation. The mom really did not want to get any money from the dad. Like, she was very against getting any money from the dad, even though she was entitled to it. And so what we worked out is that he was going to pay certain expenses. He was going to provide all of the diapers. He was going to provide all the wipes. He was going to pay all the medical expenses, those kinds of things, at least on a temporary basis. The other thing, it's funny to talk about parents waiving support, because I feel like anybody who has lawyers involved, well, not any, hopefully, and most of the time when you have a lawyer involved, the lawyer's going to understand that child support's not waivable, and we can get creative with how it's paid or how we calculate income and those kinds of things to get to where you're trying to get. But one of the things that happens all the time, and we see this all the time, is that parents work something out between themselves outside of court and outside of like a written agreement. or even sometimes they write, if they've done their initial paperwork themselves, they write into the agreement that we waive child support. And that can really come back to bite you because it's not waivable. So even if you agree that it's going to be waived, that doesn't mean that that can't be overturned or reversed or enforced later on in terms of the child support, because you don't have the ability to waive it.
Yeah.
And parents a lot of times don't know what they're doing when they enter into those kinds of agreements, which reminds me of one of my myths, which is, so a lot of parents have gone through the Department of Revenue and have gotten child support established through the Department of Revenue, but they've not ever been in a circuit court, like in a paternity custody case or divorce case or something like that. And a lot of times when people have these Department of Revenue orders, they're orders, by the way, right? Like the Department of Revenue, when you go through that, it's an order of a court, and they think they can just agree to stop paying it. And this actually, I've seen this happen after a divorce too. Like it's written, one person owes the other person $560 a month, and they verbally just have a conversation like, don't worry about the $560 a month. It's good. You did this, this, or this. And then they don't realize that once it's an order, whether it's through the Department of Revenue or through the courts, it's an order. You can't just agree verbally that you're not going to pay it anymore. And if the person who should have gotten the money decides to come back to court and say, he never paid or she never paid, they're probably going to get that money. They're going to owe that money, even though you had this verbal agreement. You can't just do what you want when there's a court order.
So it's funny that you said that. It reminds me of this case. I don't know if you're going to remember. I had it years ago where, precisely what you just said. So dad comes into my office and says, we had this agreement and I didn't have to pay child support anymore. The problem with the agreement was, it's a little complicated legally, but long story short, he signed, but apparently mom never ended up signing. No one could find a signed copy of the agreement. He's like, but we had a verbal agreement. Everybody understood. We had attorneys. I was going to stop paying. Something like 10 years go by, and mom files a motion for contempt that in 10 years.
For that.
I think he owed, I remember, if you calculate, I think it was like $150,000 in child support arrears. Luckily, because of some, legal case, we were able to find some case law. He actually didn't owe anything, which made him very, very happy. But he would have been on the hook for $150,000 in child support. And he kept saying to me, but we had this agreement. We had this verbal agreement. The attorneys know about it, and unfortunately that's not enough. Along those lines of what you were saying, something else that I think it's important for people to understand is that you can modify child support. Just because you're stuck with a court order, whether it's through an administrative case or a circuit court case, it's a court order, but it's a court order until you can get it modified. So I think it's important for people to know that they're not on the hook for that child support amount forever. So one of the things that happens is through an administrative case, you could have a child support order and not have any credit for any overnights, which is one of the reasons why we tell people go to circuit court. If it's a paternity case, file for paternity, and you can actually get it lowered in circuit court because you'll get credit for overnights. But more importantly, even after that, you can always get it modified in the future as long as there's a substantial change in the incomes. Sometimes there could be a change in the overnights too, right? So if you want more overnights, that could justify you also having to pay less in child support. So I think it's important for people to know that you can modify it in the future, but you have to keep paying that same amount that's court ordered until you go to court to have it changed again.
Yeah, because once it's an order, it's an order until a judge says it's not an order. And so no matter what the two of you agree on, it can come back to bite you. And I remember in that case, and we were able to make some interesting arguments along the lines of like
latches,
that so much time had passed, that it was not fair at this point in time. But it brings me to another thing which is really important. This is not a myth, but this is a fact, is if someone is saying that child support has not been paid, it is the payor, the person who owes the money, it's their job to prove that they've made the payments. it's not the other person's job to prove that the payments were not made. So if you're the person that owes child support and you have not been paying or you have been paying, it's your job to keep up with that. And for this guy that Naz is talking about, can you imagine that 10 years later, now it's his job to go prove that he's made payments over these 10 years of whatever kind? I mean, it would just be like a nightmare to try to figure that out. So one of the, which all of this and your conversation about modifying and overnight changes brings me to like my last myth that you are going to be very familiar with, because it is something that we hear all the time, is if the parent is not paying child support, then they don't get to see their kid.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if they're behind on their child support, no access for you, sir. Like, it does not work that way. And it's confusing because we tell people all the time, your child support is dependent upon your overnights, right? But it doesn't mean the opposite of that. It doesn't mean that your overnights are dependent upon you paying child support. So I can think of one exception to that where non-payment may have an impact. Do you know what I'm talking about? It actually is coming up in one of our cases right now. Ooh, look, I'm like quizzing her online.
I don't know. I'm trying to go through like all our cases in my head. What are you thinking?
Relocations. So if somebody is asking to relocate and the other parent hasn't been paying child support, then it may make a difference.
Maybe. We'll see. I'll let you know.
Yeah. So because it's one of the factors for relocation, but if somebody's not paying you child support, you can't just be like, yeah, so you're not going to see your kid now, right?
Correct.
So that's a breakdown of some of the myths of child support. That was actually quite a few of them.
It's a few, yeah. That's a lot. We get a lot of calls about child support.
Yeah, I think it can be confusing for people. I mean, one last thing that I do want to say, because when you said it really fast, and I understood everything you were saying, but I don't know. Sometimes I don't think people follow along with this process. So when Naz was talking about the administrative court versus the circuit court, so when you go through the Department of Revenue and you're asking for child support, what they file is an administrative case. So it doesn't go into our regular circuit court in front of the same judges that hear like custody and time sharing and divorces and all of those kinds of things. It goes into like kind of a subcategory of the courts, this administrative process. And that administrative judge does the whole child support thing. Now, do they do it like at the level of depth that we would do it in circuit court? Not necessarily. And it's just sort of an administrative process, which sometimes happens without you even going to a hearing, just based upon the paperwork that you send back. But what comes out of it is an order. It's an actual order, that administrative order. However, if you are served with papers through the Department of Revenue for an administrative case, you can ask to have the case transferred into circuit court. And in most counties, the administrative courts are not going to deal with anything related to time sharing. There's 2 counties that I know of that are just for some reason kind of popping parenting plans in, but most of the time they're not going to. So you can ask to have it moved to circuit court, and if you need time sharing or decision making addressed, then you need to move it over to circuit court so that you can have it in the family division where judges are hearing full family cases and not just the child support piece of it.
Yeah, and they can also work on a full parenting plan, and that could be next week's topic. Everything that goes.
I'm glad you just said that, because I was going to say I've loved this so much, and having your face with me on the internet world this morning, I was going to see if you wanted to do it with me again next Sunday.
I'll be here. You're slowly roping me into getting in front of this camera, but
love it.
We'll see.
Well, thanks for joining me on this Sunday morning. I'll call you later.
Happy Sunday, everyone. Bye.